I didn't react when my daughter-in-law called me a burden in the hallway of our church, but what happened 20 minutes later changed how everyone in that room saw her, and me, forever. The sanctuary was already filling when I arrived that morning, sunlight streaming through the tall stained glass windows and casting soft colors across the polished wooden pews. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, how the quiet hum of conversation and the faint sound of the organ warming up made everything seem steady, almost sacred. I had chosen a navy blue dress that day, the one my late husband Robert always said made me look composed, his word, not mine. At 68, I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just wanted to feel like myself again, if only for a couple of hours. It had been 6 months since Robert passed, and Sundays had become the only place where the silence in my house didn't feel quite so loud. I spotted my son Daniel near the front, standing beside his wife Ashley. She was wearing a cream-colored coat, her blonde hair styled perfectly, not a strand out of place. From a distance, they looked like a picture of stability, the kind of couple people nodded at with quiet approval. I started walking toward them, careful, steady steps, my heels clicking softly against the tile floor. That was when I heard it. I hadn't meant to overhear anything. I was simply passing by the side hallway that led to the fellowship room when Ashley's voice slipped through, low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this," she said, a soft laugh following her words. "She's just a burden we're stuck with." I stopped without meaning to. My hand tightened around my purse strap, the leather pressing into my palm. For a moment, I thought maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe she was talking about someone else. But then I heard Daniel's voice, quieter, hesitant. "Ashley, not here." Not a denial. Not a correction. Just discomfort. That was all it took. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I simply stood there, just out of sight, and let the words settle into me like something cold and permanent. Burden. It wasn't the first time I had felt it. The distance. The careful way Ashley spoke to me, always polite but never warm. The way decisions were made without including me. The way my presence in their home, temporary, they had called it after Robert passed, seemed to shrink a little more each week. But hearing it said out loud, so plainly, so casually, was different. It stripped away every excuse I had been quietly holding on to. I could have stepped forward. I could have cleared my throat, let them know I had heard everything. I could have demanded an explanation, an apology, something. Instead, I adjusted my coat, straightened my shoulders, and walked past the hallway as if I hadn't heard a single word. Ashley glanced at me when I entered the main aisle, her expression smooth, practiced. "Margaret," she said with a small smile, as if nothing had happened. "You made it." I nodded. "Of course," I replied, my voice steady, even to my own ears. Daniel gave me a quick hug, the kind that ended before it really began. "Good to see you, Mom." I smiled back. I had spent decades learning how to keep things contained, how to hold my composure in rooms where emotions ran high. This was no different. At least, that's what I told myself. We took our seats together, the three of us in the same pew we had shared for years. The service began, the choir rising in a gentle hymn that echoed through the high ceilings. People bowed their heads. Hands folded. The rhythm of the morning continued exactly as it always had. And I sat there, perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap, my face calm, my posture unchanged. No one looking at me would have guessed what had just been said. No one would have seen the shift happening quietly beneath the surface. I didn't cry. I didn't confront. I didn't even look at Ashley again. I simply listened. And waited. I kept my eyes forward as the service continued, following the rhythm of the morning as if nothing inside me had shifted, as if the word I had just heard had not settled somewhere deep and permanent. The choir finished their hymn, and the congregation slowly took their seats again, the soft creak of wood and the rustle of fabric blending into a familiar sound I had known for years. Pastor William Hayes stepped up to the pulpit, his presence calm and steady, his voice carrying easily through the room as he began to speak about grace, about patience, about the quiet strength it takes to endure when life does not unfold the way we expect. I listened, or at least I appeared to, but my thoughts moved somewhere else entirely, circling back to that hallway, to the tone of Ashley's voice, to the way Daniel had not corrected her. Not once. I folded my hands together in my lap, pressing my fingers gently into each other, grounding myself in something physical, something real. I had spent 35 years raising my son to be kind, to be thoughtful, to stand up for what was right even when it was uncomfortable. I remembered the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, who would bring me dandelions from the yard and say they were flowers because he thought I deserved something beautiful. I wondered, quietly, when that boy had learned to stay silent. Or if perhaps I had simply not noticed the moment he began to choose someone else's comfort over my dignity. The sunlight shifted slightly through the stained glass, casting a warm amber glow across the aisle in front of me, and for a moment, everything looked almost peaceful again. Almost. Ashley leaned slightly toward Daniel, whispering something I could not hear this time, her expression composed, her posture relaxed. If anyone had been watching her, they would have seen a devoted wife, attentive and graceful, exactly the kind of woman people praised after services in polite conversations over coffee. It was remarkable, I thought, how easily appearances could be maintained when the truth stayed hidden in quiet corners. I did not look at her again. I did not need to. Instead, I let my gaze settle on the small wooden cross at the front of the sanctuary, its simple shape steady and unchanged, a reminder of something constant in a world that had begun to feel less certain. Pastor Hayes continued speaking, his words measured and thoughtful, touching on the idea that sometimes people reveal their hearts not in grand gestures, but in small, unguarded moments when they believe no one is listening. That sentence lingered with me longer than the rest. Unintended honesty, I thought. That was what I had heard. Not anger. Not frustration spoken in the heat of the moment. But something quieter. Something practiced. The kind of truth that slips out when it has been thought many times before. I took a slow breath, steady and controlled, and let it out just as carefully. There was no need to rush anything. No need to react too quickly, to make a scene, to turn a private humiliation into a public one. I had never been that kind of person. I had always believed that dignity was not something you demanded from others, but something you chose to keep for yourself, regardless of how you were treated. The service moved forward, prayer followed by scripture followed by a brief pause where the room seemed to settle into a deeper quiet. It was in that stillness that I felt something shift again, not outwardly, but within me. The sting of Ashley's words had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, becoming something more defined, more focused. Not pain exactly. Not anymore. Something clearer. Something steadier. I straightened slightly in my seat, my shoulders aligning, my posture firm without being rigid. If anyone had glanced my way, they would have seen a woman simply sitting through a Sunday service, attentive, composed, entirely unremarkable. And that was fine. I did not need to be seen. Not yet. Pastor Hayes adjusted the papers on the pulpit, glancing down briefly before looking back up at the congregation. There was a slight pause, just long enough to feel intentional, as if he were deciding how to move forward. I noticed it, though I could not have said why. Perhaps it was the way his expression softened for just a moment, or the way his eyes seemed to sweep the room more deliberately than before. Something was different. Subtle, but present. I felt it without understanding it, like the quiet shift in the air before a change in weather. And for the first time since stepping into that hallway, I realized that the morning was not going to end the way it had begun. I remained still, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my gaze steady, my breathing even. I had heard what I needed to hear. Now, I would simply wait. I noticed the shift before anyone else seemed to, a quiet pause that stretched just a second longer than usual as Pastor Hayes rested his hands on the edges of the pulpit, his fingers pressing lightly against the wood as if grounding himself before continuing. The room settled into a deeper silence, the kind that made even the smallest movement feel amplified, a cough in the back row, the soft rustle of a program being folded, the faint hum of the air system above. I kept my posture steady, my gaze forward, but something inside me had become more alert, more aware of the subtle changes unfolding around me. Pastor Hayes cleared his throat gently, then looked out over the congregation with a different expression than before, something more deliberate, more measured. Before we close today, he began, his voice calm but carrying a weight that had not been there earlier, there is something I have been asked to share. A few heads lifted. It was not uncommon for announcements or special notes to be read at the end of a service, but there was something in his tone that made people pay closer attention. I felt it too, a quiet pull of curiosity, though I kept my expression unchanged. This message was entrusted to me some time ago, he continued, glancing briefly down at the paper in front of him before looking back up, with the understanding that it would be read at the appropriate moment. My fingers stilled in my lap. I did not move, but I listened more carefully now, every word landing with a clarity that cut through the lingering haze of the morning. Ashley shifted slightly beside Daniel, her posture adjusting as if she, too, sensed something unusual, though her expression remained composed. Daniel leaned forward just a fraction, his brows drawing together in quiet confusion. Pastor Hayes unfolded the paper slowly, the sound of it faint but distinct in the silence. It is a letter, he said, written by someone many of us here knew well. There was a pause, brief but intentional. Robert Collins. The name settled over the room like a ripple, subtle but unmistakable. I felt it pass through me, not as shock, but as something steadier, something that reached deeper than surprise. I had not known about any letter. Robert had always been a thoughtful man, careful with his words, deliberate in the things he chose to leave behind. But this was unexpected. I kept my face calm, my breathing even, though my attention had sharpened completely now. Pastor Hayes lowered his eyes to the page and began to read. To those who gather here today, he said, his voice steady, I hope this message finds you in a place of reflection and honesty. I have lived a life blessed with family, with community, and with a wife whose strength has been the foundation of everything I have built. I did not close my eyes. I did not bow my head. I simply listened. Each word felt deliberate, unmistakably Robert's voice carried through someone else. Around me, the congregation remained quiet, attentive, drawn in by the sincerity of the message. Ashley's stillness beside me felt different now, less relaxed, more controlled. Daniel had stopped shifting altogether, his focus fixed entirely on the front of the room. Pastor Hayes continued, his tone unchanged but the meaning beneath his words beginning to take shape. There is something I have come to understand in my later years, he read. It is not what people say to your face that reveals their character, but what they say when they believe no one is listening. A faint tension moved through the room, subtle but present, like a thread being pulled just tight enough to be felt. I remained still, my hands resting lightly together, my posture unchanged, but inside, something aligned with those words in a way that felt almost precise. Pastor Hayes paused briefly, allowing the sentence to settle, then continued. I have taken steps to ensure that what I leave behind reflects not only my intentions, but also the values I have lived by. Kindness, respect, integrity. These are not optional qualities. They are the measure by which I believe a person should be judged. I could feel the attention of the room deepen, the quiet becoming more focused, more aware. Ashley shifted again, a small movement, but enough to break the stillness around her. Daniel glanced at her briefly, then back to the front, his expression no longer just confused, but uncertain. I did not turn to look at them. I did not need to. The change was already happening, slowly, steadily, unfolding in front of all of us. Pastor Hayes lifted his gaze from the paper for a moment, scanning the room before continuing, his voice just as calm as before. For this reason, I have made certain provisions clear, he read, so that there will be no misunderstanding. The way my wife is treated after I am gone will not go unnoticed, and it will not be without consequence. The words settled into the silence with a quiet finality. I felt them, not as a surprise, but as something that had been waiting, something that had always been there, just beyond my awareness. And for the first time that morning, I allowed myself the smallest shift, a single breath drawn just a little deeper than before. I did not look at Ashley. I did not look at Daniel. I kept my gaze forward, steady, composed. But I knew, without needing to see, that everything in that room had just begun to change. Pastor Hayes did not raise his voice, but the weight of each word seemed to settle deeper into the room, pressing gently but firmly against every person seated there as he continued reading. I have arranged my affairs in such a way that my estate will reflect not only my love for my family, but also my expectations of them. There was a subtle shift among the congregation now, a quiet awareness spreading row by row, as if people were beginning to understand that this was not simply a message of remembrance, but something more precise, more deliberate. I remained still, my hands resting lightly together, my posture unchanged, but my attention was unwavering, every word aligning with a clarity that felt almost inevitable. To my wife, Margaret, Pastor Hayes read, his tone steady, "You have been my partner in every sense of the word. Everything I have built, you have built with me. Everything I leave behind is as much yours as it has ever been mine." A warmth moved through me at those words, not sudden or overwhelming, but steady, familiar, like the echo of a voice I had known for decades. I did not smile. I did not lower my head. I simply received it, quietly, without outward reaction. Around me, the room remained silent, attentive, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer passive. It was focused. However, Pastor Hayes continued, and that single word seemed to draw the air tighter in the room, "There are conditions tied to the distribution of my assets." A faint rustle moved through the pews, subtle but unmistakable. I could feel Ashley shift beside Daniel again, a small adjustment, but no longer casual. Daniel's shoulders stiffened slightly, his posture no longer relaxed. I kept my gaze forward. Any individual who shows disregard, disrespect, or neglect toward my wife after my passing, Pastor Hayes read, will forfeit any claim to the inheritance I have set aside for them. The sentence landed with a quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. The kind of statement that did not need emphasis to be understood. I felt the shift beside me more clearly now, the stillness from Ashley no longer controlled, but held, as if she were carefully measuring her reaction. Daniel inhaled slowly, his breath just audible enough in the silence. I did not turn. I did not acknowledge. I simply listened. Pastor Hayes paused briefly, allowing the meaning of the words to settle fully before continuing. "This includes financial support, property, and all remaining assets," he read. "There will be no exceptions." A deeper silence followed, heavier now, more aware. I could sense the attention of others in the room beginning to shift, not openly, not in a way that would draw notice, but enough to feel. People were listening differently now. Not just to the message, but to what it implied. "Kindness is not a suggestion," Pastor Hayes continued, his voice calm, unwavering. "It is a requirement." I felt something steady inside me, not rising, not overwhelming, but grounding. The uncertainty that had lingered quietly in the background of my days since Robert's passing had begun to take shape, to settle into something clearer. I had not known about this letter. I had not needed to. He had known enough for both of us. Ashley's hand moved slightly, adjusting the edge of her sleeve, a small, controlled motion, but it carried a tension that had not been there before. Daniel glanced toward her again, his expression no longer uncertain, but strained, as if he were trying to understand something that had already become clear. I remained still. There was no need to look. No need to confirm what I could already feel. Pastor Hayes lowered the paper just slightly, then continued, his tone unchanged. "I trust that this will encourage reflection," he read. "That it will remind those I leave behind that relationships are not sustained by obligation, but by respect." The word respect lingered in the air longer than the rest, settling into the quiet space between one breath and the next. I let it settle. I did not rush it. I did not resist it. I simply allowed it to be. The church, with its soft light and familiar walls, felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because something unseen had been brought into the open. What had once been spoken in quiet corners had now been placed where it could not be ignored. I adjusted my hand slightly in my lap, a small movement, controlled, deliberate. I did not need to say anything. I did not need to react. The words had already done what they needed to do. And for the first time since that moment in the hallway, I no longer felt like I was standing just outside of something. I was exactly where I needed to be. The silence did not break immediately after those words were read, but it changed, becoming heavier, more aware, as if every person in that room had just been asked to reconsider something they thought they understood. Pastor Hayes did not rush to finish. He allowed the quiet to linger, his hands resting calmly on the pulpit, his posture steady, as though he understood that what had just been said needed space to settle. I remained exactly as I was, my back straight, my hands folded lightly in my lap, my gaze forward, but inside, something had shifted with a clarity that no longer felt uncertain. It was not relief. It was not vindication. It was something steadier than both. Something that felt like alignment. Pastor Hayes lifted the paper again and continued, I do not expect perfection from those I leave behind. I understand that life brings strain, that relationships are tested in ways we do not always anticipate. But there is a difference between struggle and disregard. His voice did not change, but the meaning beneath it grew sharper, more defined. To disregard the person who stood beside me for decades is to disregard everything I have built. That is not something I am willing to reward. A faint movement passed through the pews again, not loud, not disruptive, but present. I could feel it without looking. Ashley's stillness beside Daniel had become something more rigid now, controlled in a way that required effort. Daniel shifted slightly, his hands clasping together, then releasing, then clasping again, as if he were trying to settle himself but could not quite find the right position. I did not turn. I did not acknowledge. There was nothing I needed to confirm. Pastor Hayes continued, his tone as even as it had been from the beginning. I have made arrangements with my attorney to ensure that these conditions are upheld without exception, he read. If my wife is made to feel unwelcome, unsupported, or diminished in any way, the consequences will be immediate and final. The words settled into the room with a quiet certainty that left no room for interpretation. Immediate. Final. Not negotiable. I felt my breath deepen slightly, not out of tension, but out of recognition. Robert had always been precise. He had never spoken in vague terms when something mattered. He had believed that clarity was a form of respect, that leaving things unsaid only created confusion where there should have been understanding. And now, even in his absence, that clarity remained. Ashley's hand moved again, this time more noticeably, adjusting her coat sleeve with a motion that was just a fraction too quick to be entirely controlled. Daniel leaned closer to her, his voice low, barely audible, but the shift in his posture was enough to reveal his unease. I did not need to hear what he said. The silence between their words was enough. Pastor Hayes lowered the paper slightly, then continued, I leave this message not out of anger, but out of trust. Trust that the truth of how we treat one another will always reveal itself. The sentence lingered, softer than the others, but no less certain. I let it settle within me, not as something new, but as something confirmed. For months, I had questioned myself in small, quiet ways. I had wondered if I was imagining the distance, if I was misreading the subtle shifts in tone, the small exclusions, the careful politeness that never quite reached warmth. I had told myself that grief changed people, that time would smooth the edges of what felt uncomfortable. But the truth, as Robert had written, did not need to be forced into the open. It revealed itself, eventually, in moments when no one thought it would. Pastor Hayes folded the paper slowly, the sound of it soft but deliberate, and placed it back on the pulpit. He looked out over the congregation, his expression calm, but there was a quiet weight in his gaze now, something that suggested he understood the significance of what had just been shared. Let us take a moment, he said gently, to reflect on what it means to show kindness not just in words, but in action. The room remained still. No one moved quickly. No one spoke. The usual rhythm of the service had been altered, not disrupted, but shifted into something more contemplative. I adjusted my hands slightly, my fingers relaxing where they had been lightly pressed together. I did not feel smaller anymore. I did not feel uncertain. The word I had heard in the hallway still existed, unchanged, but it no longer held the same weight. It had been placed into the open now, not by me, not by confrontation, but by something far more undeniable. I turned my gaze slightly, just enough to see the edge of Ashley's profile without fully looking at her. Her expression remained composed, but the stillness there was no longer effortless. It was held. Maintained. And that made all the difference. I looked forward again, my posture unchanged, my expression calm. I had not spoken. I had not defended myself. I had not needed to. Everything that needed to be understood had already been said. The final hymn began softly, the first notes rising through the sanctuary like something fragile, something that did not yet know the weight of what had just been revealed, and people slowly reached for their programs, their voices joining in almost automatically, as if routine could still carry them through a moment that no longer felt ordinary. I remained seated for a second longer than usual, my hands resting calmly in my lap, allowing the sound to settle around me before I stood, smoothing the front of my dress with a small, deliberate motion. Around me, the congregation followed the familiar pattern, but there was a difference now, a subtle hesitation in the way people moved, the way their eyes shifted, the way conversations that usually began in quiet whispers had not yet found their way back. I sang when the others sang, my voice steady, measured, not loud, not withdrawn, simply present. I had spent years learning how to remain composed in rooms where expectations were unspoken but deeply understood, and this was no different. When the final note faded, there was a brief pause, longer than usual, before the room began to stir again, people turning slightly, gathering their things, offering polite nods and quiet greetings as they always did. But now, those gestures carried something else beneath them. Awareness. I felt it in the way a woman across the aisle glanced toward me, then quickly looked away. In the way a man near the front adjusted his glasses and lingered just a moment too long before stepping into the aisle. Nothing overt. Nothing that could be pointed to directly. But it was there. I reached for my purse, lifting it gently from the pew, my movements unhurried, controlled. Daniel shifted beside me, his posture no longer as certain as it had been earlier, his hands moving as if unsure what to do next. Ashley remained still for a moment, then stood, smoothing her coat in a motion that was precise, practiced, but just slightly tighter than before. I did not look at either of them right away. I stepped into the aisle, allowing a couple in front of me to move ahead, my pace steady, my gaze forward. The space between us felt different now, not defined by proximity, but by something less visible, something that had been placed there without a single word from me. "Mom," Daniel said quietly as he fell into step beside me, his voice lower than usual, careful. I turned my head just enough to acknowledge him, my expression calm, my eyes steady. "Yes?" I replied, my tone even, without strain, without hesitation. He hesitated, the pause small but noticeable. "I did not know about that letter," he said. The words came out measured, as if he had considered them carefully before speaking. I held his gaze for a brief moment, not long enough to create discomfort, but long enough to let the space between us remain clear. "Neither did I said simply. No accusation. No emphasis. Just truth." Ashley walked slightly ahead of us, her posture straight, her steps controlled, but there was a tension in the way she held herself now, a subtle stiffness that had not been there before. She did not turn around. She did not speak. And I did not call her back. We moved toward the exit together, but not as a unit, not in the way families often do after a service, close and connected. Instead, there was a distance that no one tried to close. The sunlight outside was brighter than I expected, spilling across the steps and warming the air just enough to make the transition from the quiet interior feel sharper, more defined. I stepped out onto the stone walkway, the sound of footsteps and low conversations gradually building behind me as others followed. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the light settle on my face, letting the air move around me, steady and real. Daniel joined me again, standing slightly to my side, his presence familiar, but changed. "We should talk," he said after a moment, his voice careful, searching. I looked at him, really looked this time, taking in the lines of his face, the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he seemed to be standing between two things he did not yet know how to separate. I had seen that look before, years ago, when he was younger, when decisions felt heavier than he expected them to be. But this was different. This was not confusion. This was consequence. I gave a small nod, not immediate, not dismissive, simply acknowledging the moment for what it was. "We will," I said. "Not now. Not here." Just a statement, steady and complete. Ashley stepped out a moment later, her gaze moving briefly across the area before settling somewhere ahead, avoiding both of us without making it obvious. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her movements composed, but not effortless. I watched her for a second, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that had not been there before. The word she had used still existed, unchanged, but it no longer defined anything about me. It had revealed something about her. And now, that truth was no longer hidden in a quiet hallway. It had been placed where it could not be ignored. I turned away, my posture straight, my steps steady as I began walking down the path away from the church, not quickly, not dramatically, just forward, exactly as I had always done, but this time without the weight I had been carrying before. The walk from the church steps to the parking lot felt longer than usual, not because of the distance, but because of the quiet that followed us, a quiet that no longer belonged only to me, but to something shared, something exposed. The gravel beneath my shoes made a soft, steady sound with each step, grounding, familiar, and I focused on it for a moment, allowing the rhythm to settle my thoughts. I had spent months adjusting to absence, to silence, to the way a house could feel different when one voice was no longer there. But this silence was not the same. This one had edges. Daniel walked a few steps behind me now, no longer beside me, as if he had not yet decided where he should stand. I did not turn around. I did not slow down. I simply continued forward, my posture unchanged, my pace even. The sunlight warmed the back of my shoulders, and for a brief moment, I remembered other Sundays, years ago, when Robert and I would walk out together, side by side, discussing the sermon, exchanging small observations about people we had known for decades. Those moments had been simple. Uncomplicated. But they had been real. And now, standing in their place, was something else entirely. "Mom," Daniel's voice came again, closer this time, more certain than before, though still careful. I stopped walking, not abruptly, just enough to let the moment settle before turning to face him. He looked different out here, not because anything about him had physically changed, but because the distance between us was no longer hidden behind routine or politeness. It was visible now. Clear. "I did not know things were like this," he said, his voice lower, his expression searching mine as if trying to find something he had missed. I held his gaze, steady, without accusation, without softness. "Just truth." "You did not ask," I replied. The words were not sharp. They did not need to be. They were simple. Complete. He blinked once, the weight of that answer settling in a way that no explanation could have replaced. Ashley approached then, her steps measured, her expression composed, though not as effortlessly as before. She stopped a short distance from us, not close enough to join, not far enough to remain separate. It was a careful position. Deliberate. "Margaret," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, the same tone she had used so many times before, but now there was something else beneath it, something tighter, less certain. "I think there has been a misunderstanding." I turned my head slightly to look at her, not fully, just enough to meet her eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The space between her words and mine remained open, unfilled, waiting. "No," I said calmly. "There has not." The air between us shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. She held my gaze for a second longer, then adjusted her posture, her shoulders lifting just slightly as if reinforcing the control she was trying to maintain. "What I said earlier," she began, her voice still measured, it was taken out of context. I did not respond immediately. I allowed the silence to remain, not as resistance, but as clarity. Context. It was an interesting word. A word people used when they wanted to reshape something that had already revealed itself clearly. "I heard exactly what you said," I replied, my tone even, without emotion, without emphasis. "Just fact." Daniel shifted beside her, his eyes moving between us, the tension in his posture no longer hidden. "Ashley," he said quietly, not firm, not corrective, but uncertain. She did not look at him. Her focus remained on me, her expression composed, but no longer effortless. "I think we should talk about this privately," she said, her voice softening slightly, though the control remained. I studied her for a moment, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity. For so long, I had filled in the gaps for her, explained away the distance, softened the edges of things that did not feel right. But there was nothing unclear now. Nothing that needed interpretation. "There is nothing to discuss," I said. The words were quiet, but they did not waver. Daniel inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling as if he were trying to steady himself within a situation he had not prepared for. "Mom, please," he said, his voice lower now, more urgent, though still controlled. I looked at him again, really looked this time, and for a moment, I saw the boy he had been, layered beneath the man he had become, the one who had chosen silence when it mattered most. "We will talk," I said, echoing my earlier words, but this time with a clearer boundary. "But not to fix what has already been made clear." Ashley's expression shifted, just slightly, the composure tightening again, the control returning in a different form. She nodded once, a small, contained motion, as if accepting something she did not fully agree with, but could not deny. I did not wait for another response. I turned back toward my car, my steps steady, my posture unchanged. The conversation had not been loud. It had not been dramatic. But it had been enough. For the first time, I was not adjusting myself to fit into the space they had created. I was simply stepping out of it. I did not look back as I reached my car, not because I was trying to prove something, but because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore. The sound of the church doors opening and closing echoed faintly across the parking lot, followed by low conversations that carried just enough to be heard without being understood. I placed my hand on the door handle, pausing for a brief moment as the warmth of the sun settled against my skin, grounding me in a way that felt simple and real. For months, I had adjusted my movements, my words, even my expectations, trying to fit into a space that had slowly been shrinking around me. I had told myself it was temporary. That things would settle. That people needed time. But standing there, with the quiet of the morning still lingering around me, I realized something that no longer needed explanation. Some spaces are not meant to be adjusted to. They are meant to be left. I opened the car door and sat down, the familiar interior wrapping around me with a sense of stillness that felt entirely my own. I did not start the engine right away. I simply sat there, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my gaze forward. Through the windshield, I could see Daniel and Ashley stepping out of the building, their figures framed by the bright light behind them. They paused at the top of the steps, speaking to someone briefly, their expressions composed, practiced, as if nothing had shifted. But I could see it now, the small differences in their movements, the way Daniel's shoulders carried a weight that had not been there before, the way Ashley's posture remained controlled, but no longer effortless. The truth had not changed them completely. But it had unsettled something. And that was enough. Daniel spotted my car and began walking toward it, his pace measured, not rushed, as if he were giving himself time to decide what to say. Ashley remained behind for a moment, speaking to a woman I recognized from the choir, her smile in place, her gestures precise. From a distance, she looked exactly the same. But distance has a way of hiding what is no longer hidden. Daniel reached the passenger side and paused, his hand resting lightly on the window before he leaned down slightly, his expression careful. I lowered the window just enough to hear him clearly, the cool air brushing lightly against my face. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter now, more deliberate than before, "please do not leave like this." I looked at him, not with resistance, not with softness, just with clarity. "Like what?" I asked, my tone calm, steady. He hesitated, the question catching him off guard, forcing him to consider something he had not fully defined. "Without talking," he said after a moment. I held his gaze for a second, then shifted my eyes forward again, resting them on the empty stretch of road ahead. "We already have," I replied. The words were simple, but they carried everything that had been said and everything that had not. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just slightly as the meaning settled in. "That is not what I meant," he said, his voice lower now, almost careful. I nodded once, acknowledging the difference without correcting it. "I know," I said. There was a pause, quiet but full, the kind that does not ask to be filled. Ashley approached then, her steps measured, her expression composed once more, though the tension remained just beneath the surface. She stopped beside Daniel, her gaze meeting mine through the open window. For a brief moment, none of us spoke. The morning air moved between us, carrying the distant sounds of conversation, of car doors closing, of footsteps on pavement. "We should go home," she said finally, her voice smooth, controlled, as if returning to something familiar would restore what had shifted. I looked at her, really looked this time, not at the expression she was presenting, but at the effort behind it. "I am going home," I said. The distinction was small, but it was enough. Daniel glanced between us, the tension in his posture no longer hidden, his uncertainty more visible now that there was nothing left to cover it. "We can figure this out," he said, his voice carrying a quiet urgency, though still restrained. I placed my hands gently on the steering wheel, my fingers resting there without gripping, without tension. "There is nothing to figure out," I replied. Ashley's expression tightened for just a fraction of a second before smoothing again, her composure returning in the same controlled way it always had. "You are overreacting," she said, her tone calm, almost reasonable, the words chosen carefully. I did not respond immediately. I allowed the silence to settle once more, not as hesitation, but as clarity. "No," I said. Quietly. "I am responding exactly as I should." The air between us shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to mark the difference. Daniel looked down briefly, then back up, as if searching for something that had already been lost. Ashley held her position, her posture steady, her expression composed, but no longer effortless. I raised the window slowly, the glass moving upward with a soft, final sound that separated us without force, without conflict, just distance. Then I started the engine, the familiar vibration steady beneath my hands, and without looking back, I pulled out of the parking lot, leaving behind a place that had not changed, but no longer held the same meaning it once did. I did not drive fast as I left the parking lot, and I did not turn on the radio the way I sometimes did when the silence felt too heavy to carry alone. Instead, I let the quiet remain, not as something pressing against me, but as something steady, something that no longer needed to be filled. The road ahead stretched out in a familiar line, the same streets I had driven for years, passing the same houses, the same trees, the same small details that once felt like part of a shared life. But that morning, everything looked slightly different, not because anything had changed, but because I was seeing it without the weight I had been carrying before. I stopped at a red light and rested my hands lightly on the steering wheel, my fingers relaxed, my posture calm. There was no tightness in my chest, no rush of emotion waiting to surface. Just stillness. And clarity. For a long time, I had believed that staying meant strength. That enduring meant loyalty. That adjusting, softening, stepping back when necessary, was part of what it meant to keep a family together. And maybe, once, that had been true. But there is a difference between holding something together and holding yourself in place while everything else moves away from you. I had not seen that clearly before. Or perhaps I had, in small, quiet moments that I chose not to name. The light turned green, and I moved forward, my pace steady, unhurried. A few blocks later, I passed a small park where Robert and I used to walk on Sunday afternoons, his hand always just slightly brushing mine, never needing to hold tightly, because the connection was already there. I thought about him then, not with sadness, not with the sharp edge of loss that had followed me in the early months, but with something softer. Something that felt like understanding. He had known. Not everything, not every detail, but enough. Enough to leave behind something that did not just protect what he had built, but protected me. Not by shielding me from the truth, but by making sure I would see it clearly when the time came. I turned into my driveway and parked the car, the engine settling into silence as I turned the key. For a moment, I remained seated, my hands resting lightly where they had been, my gaze forward. The house stood exactly as I had left it, quiet, unchanged, the front porch catching the afternoon light in a way that felt almost welcoming. I stepped out of the car and closed the door gently behind me, the sound soft, final, but not heavy. Inside, the air felt still, familiar, the faint scent of the candles I had burned the night before lingering just enough to be noticed. I set my purse down on the table by the door and walked slowly into the living room, my steps unhurried, my movements deliberate. Nothing had changed here. The furniture remained where it had always been. The photographs on the wall still held the same moments, the same smiles, the same versions of us that had once felt permanent. I paused in front of one of them, a picture taken years ago, Robert standing beside me, Daniel between us, younger, smiling, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. I studied it for a moment, not searching for something lost, but recognizing something that had been true then, even if it was no longer true now. I did not take the photo down. I did not turn it away. I simply let it remain where it was, part of a story that did not need to be erased to be understood differently. I moved toward the window and looked out at the quiet street, the afternoon stretching calmly ahead, untouched by what had happened that morning. Life had not stopped. It had not shifted dramatically. But something inside me had settled into place. I was not a burden. Not because someone had finally said otherwise, but because I had stopped accepting a space where that word could exist. There was a difference. A quiet one. But real. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the simple motion grounding, familiar. As I set the glass down, I noticed the small calendar on the wall, the days marked neatly in my own handwriting, appointments, reminders, things that needed to be done. I picked up a pen and added something new, not large, not dramatic, just a small note for the following week. Meet with attorney. I set the pen down and looked at the words for a moment, not with urgency, not with fear, just with intention. There were things that would need to be addressed. Conversations that would happen. Decisions that would be made. But none of them needed to be rushed. For the first time in a long while, I was not reacting. I was choosing. I walked back into the living room and sat down, the quiet settling around me once more, but now it felt different. Not empty. Not heavy. Just mine. I did not reach for the phone. I did not feel the need to explain, to defend, to revisit what had already been made clear. Some things do not require repetition. They require acceptance. And distance. I leaned back slightly, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my breathing even, my thoughts steady. The morning had revealed something I could not unhear, but it had also given me something I had not fully recognized before. Not power. Not control. Something quieter than both. Freedom. And I did not need to say it out loud for it to be true.